Recording started. Zoom out button.
Well, very good morning, dear students, 12th F and 12D. I'm back with you again, and now we'll take up the story. Let's first see the introduction that they have given. It is the time of war. An American prisoner of war is washed ashore in a dying state and is found at the doorstep of a Japanese doctor. Now the question is, should he should he save him as a doctor, or hand him over to the army as a prisoner of war? Now, this story presents a clash between patriotism and humanitarianism. It shows a doctor who has received his education from America, but he's Japanese. He's a Japanese, and the story is set at the time of World War II, when that is America and Japan, were at the opposite sides. You may have heard, everyone knows about it, that America dropped the first atom bomb on Hiroshima and then Nagasaki. So the Second World War was going on, and the doctor called Sado, he received all his education from America and came to his country, and then one day, because his house was situated near the beach, so he found one American, he was a soldier from American Navy, washed ashore in a dying state on his doorsteps. Now he was faced with a question: should he save him as showing his humanitarianism, or should he hand him to the authorities as a prisoner of war? In fact, the man was a prisoner of war. He was a young boy of about 17. Remember that both Sado and his wife Hana, they are deeply patriotic. They love their country, but they are driven by humanity to look after him. They save him, and Sado even operates upon him successfully. But then he plans to kill him with a Japanese general, who forgets to send the assassins quietly. Later on, Sado helps him to escape to an island, and that was his victory. Despite all his hatred for America and the Americans, he could not kill him. That's because he had a deep sense of humanity within him. Hana also was driven by humanity. You see, sometimes we are faced with such tough situations in life when we have to choose between two things, and we have to choose between two ideals. Patriotism is an ideal. Similarly, humanitarianism too is an ideal. But ultimately, in a true human being, the humanitarian spirit wins, and it helps him overcome the narrow prejudices. देखिए, अब इंटरनेशनलिज्म का ज़माना है. ये नेशनलिज्म, पेट्रियाटिज्म, ये चीज़ें ह्यूमैनिटी के आगे मैटर नहीं करती. हालांकि वो एक प्रिजनर ऑफ वॉर था, वो जापान के ख़िलाफ़ लड़ रहा था. तो जापान में जब वो आया, ज़ख्मी होके समंदर में बहता हुआ चला आया, तो उसको मार दिया जाना चाहिए था. लेकिन ये एक ह्यूमैनिटी है. आजकल ह्यूमन राइट्स होते हैं प्रिजनर्स के भी. देखिए, प्रिजनर वॉर को यूजुअली टॉर्चर किया जाता है, उन्हें अजियतें दी जाती हैं, मारा पीटा जाता है. लेकिन ह्यूमैनिटी हमें सिखाती है कि हमें उन्हें मारना नहीं चाहिए. अगर वो सरेंडर कर दें तो फिर हमें उनकी देखभाल करनी चाहिए, लुक आफ्टर करना चाहिए, और फिर अकॉर्डिंग टू इंटरनेशनल लॉ अगर वो दूसरा कंट्री डिमांड करता है और अगर ये मुनासिब होता है तो उस कंट्री के हवाले कर देना चाहिए। अदरवाइज़ हम अपनी ही कंट्री में उसे रख सकते हैं कैदी बना के, लेकिन हम ह्यूमैनिटी के अगेंस्ट नहीं जा सकते। अगर दुनिया में हर कंट्री और हर कंट्री के रहने वाले इन ह्यूमन वैल्यूज़ का, ह्यूमैनिटेरियन वैल्यूज़ को फॉलो करें, तो वॉर में जो तलखियाँ हो जाती हैं, जो हेट्रेड हो जाती है कंट्री टू कंट्री, पीपल टू पीपल, लोग एक दूसरे से नफरत करने लगते हैं, जबकि उनका एक दूसरे से कोई इतना ताल्लुक़ भी नहीं होता। माने कोई वो एक दूसरे के सामने नहीं होते, आर्मी होती है एक दूसरे के सामने, तो वो नफ़रतें भी ख़त्म हो सकती हैं, वॉर भी ख़त्म हो सकती है। एक कंट्री का, अगर इसको इस तरह से सोचें कि अगर आप ही के यहाँ का कोई सोल्जर किसी दूसरी कंट्री के हाथ इस तरह लग जाए तो वो भी उसे ब्रूटली टॉर्चर करते हैं और फिर मार देते हैं। तो हम इसे पसंद नहीं करते। जब हम पसंद नहीं करते तो हमें भी किसी कंट्री के किसी प्रिजनर ऑफ वॉर को या सोल्जर को मारने का कोई राइट नहीं है। तो दिस कॉन्फ्लिक्ट इज प्रेजेंटेड बाय द स्टोरी and we'll focus on this conflict, that's the main concern. Now I'll comment here and there where the comments and suggestions are required and explain wherever the explanation is required, otherwise I'll read on. So please follow me in your books attentively and listen to it carefully. Now this part of the story shows us who was Dr. Sado and where was his house. Dr. Sado Hokai's house was built on a plot of Japanese coast where as a little boy he had often played. The low square stone house was set upon rocks well above a narrow beach that was outlined with bent pines, that means marked with bent pines. As a boy, Sado had often climbed the pines, supporting himself on his bare feet as he had seen men do in the South Seas when they climbed for coconuts. His father had often taken him to the islands of those seas, and never had he failed to say to that little brave boy at his side, "Those islands yonder, they are the stepping stones to future for Japan." Yonder means there. "Where shall we step from them?" Sado had asked. Seriously. "Who knows?" his father had answered. "Who can limit our future? It depends on what we make it." So Sado's father suggesting that you know it depends on us actually what we make of our future. And look, Sado had taken this into his mind, as he did everything his father said. His father, who never joked or played with him, but who spent infinite pains upon him who was his only son. Sado knew that his education was his father's chief concern. For this reason, he had been sent at 22 to America to learn all that could be learned of surgery and medicine. He had come back at 30, and before his father died, he had seen Sado become famous not only as a surgeon but as a scientist, because he was perfecting a discovery which would render wounds entirely clean. He had not been sent abroad with the troops. Also, he knew There was some slight danger that the old general might need an operation for a condition for which he was now being treated medically, and for this possibility, Sado was being kept in Japan. So there were two reasons why Sado was allowed to stay in Japan and why he was not sent with the troops. Firstly, because he was trying to perfect a discovery which would render the wounds clean, and secondly, there was an old general who was likely to have an operation, uh, a surgery for which he was being treated. So, because the Sado was the only person who could perform that operation, so for these two reasons, he was kept inside the country. Clouds were rising now from the ocean. Um, the unexpected warmth of the past few days had at night drawn heavy fog from the cold waves. Sado watched mists hide outlines of a little island near the shore and then come creeping up the beach below the house, reading around the pines. In a few minutes, fog would be wrapped about the house too. Then he would go into uh, the room where Hana, his wife, would be waiting for him with two children. But at this moment, the door opened and she looked out. A dark blue woolen houri uh, over her kimono. Kimono is also a kind of dress, worn by Japanese. She came to she came to him affectionately and put her arm through his as he stood, smiled and said nothing. He had met Hana in America, but he had waited to fall in love with her until he was sure she was Japanese. His father would never have received her unless she had been pure in her race. So the father was a typical Japanese. He wanted a daughter-in-law who was pure in her race, who was purely Japanese. He wondered often whom he would have married if he had not met Hana, and by what luck he had found her in the most casual way, by chance, literally at an American professor's house. The professor and his wife had been kind people, anxious to do something for their few foreign students, and the students, though bored, had accepted this kindness. So this means that even in America, there were nice people like this couple, the professor and his wife, who tried to help the foreign students. Sado had often told Hana how nearly he had not gone to Professor Harley's house that night. The rooms were so small, the food so bad, the professor's wife so voluble. But he had gone there, and there he had found Hano, a new student, and had felt he would love her if it were at all possible. Now he felt her hand on his arm and was aware of the pleasure it gave him, even though they had been married years enough to have two children. Uh, for they had not married heedlessly in America. They had finished their work at school and had come back home to Japan, and when his father had seen her The marriage had been arranged in old Japanese way, although Sado and Hana had talked everything over beforehand. They were perfectly happy. She laid her cheek against his arm. It was at this moment that both of them saw something black come out of the mists. It was a man. He was flung up out of the ocean, flung it seemed to his feet by a breaker. He staggered a few steps, his body outlined against the mist, his arms above his head. Then the curled mist hid him again. Who's that? Hannah cried. She dropped Sado's arm and they both leaned over the railing of the veranda. Now they saw him again. The man was on his hands and knees crawling. Then they saw him fall on his face and lie there. A fisherman, perhaps, Sado said, washed from his boat. He ran quickly down the steps, and behind him, Hannah came, her white sleeves flying. So Sado thought that perhaps it was a fisherman. Uh, a mile or two away on either side there were fishing villages, but here was only the bare and lonely coast, dangerous with rocks. The surf beyond the beach, that is, the seawater beyond the beach, was spiked with rocks. That is, it was having sharp pointed rocks. Somehow the man had managed to come through them. He must be badly torn. They saw when they came toward him that indeed it was so. The sand on one side of him had already a stain of red soaking through. He is wounded, Sado exclaimed. Uh, he made haste to the man, who lay motionless, his face in the sand, an old cap stuck to his head, soaked with sea water. He was in wet rags of garments. Sado stopped, Hana at his side, and turned the man's head. They saw the face. Now remember, up to that time, they both of them thought that it was a fisherman, and most probably it was a Japanese. Now, Sado, ran quickly to the injured person because he was a doctor, and all doctors take an oath that they would do their best to, you know, save a man's life, no matter to whichever race, religion, country he belongs to. So initially Sado was inspired by that um, feeling of being a doctor. But now see, when they turned his face and looked at it, a white man, Hana whispered. Yes, it was a white man. The wet cap fell away, and there was his wet yellow hair, long, as though for many weeks it had not been cut, and upon his young and tortured face was a rough yellow beard. He was unconscious and knew nothing that they did for him. Now, Sado remembered the wound, and with his expert fingers, he began to search for it. Now, Sado, for a moment, forgot all about his identity.
Windows 1 slash idea video compressor slash the enemy part 132 x 108.
Sorry, there was some technical disturbance. So, for a moment, Sado forgot that he was a white man, and he continued, or rather, began helping the man. He began to search for the wound. Blood flowed freshly. at his touch. On the right side of his lower back, Sado saw that a gun wound had been reopened. The flesh was blackened with powder. Powder here means gunpowder. Sometimes, not many days ago, the man had been shot and had not been tended, that is, had not been looked after. It was bad chance that the rock had struck the wound, so because the rock had struck the wound open, so he was badly injured. So now we know that Dr. Sado was a Japanese and his house was situated at the beach. Now in this part we'll find out whether Dr. Sado would be arrested on charge of harboring an enemy. Remember, he is an enemy. Okay. Oh, how he is bleeding. Hana whispered again in solemn voice. The mist screened them now completely, and at this time of day, not one came by. So they were all alone, nobody could see them. The fishermen had gone home, and even the chance beachcombers would have considered the day at an end. What shall we do with this man? Sado muttered, but his trained hands seemed of their own will to be doing what they could to stanch the fearful bleeding. He packed the wound with sea moss that strewed the beach. The man moaned with pain in his stupor, but he did not awaken. The best thing that we could do would be to put him back in the sea, Sado said, answering himself. Now that the bleeding was stopped for the moment, he stood up and dusted the sand from his hands. Yes, undoubtedly, that would be the best, Hana said steadily, but she continued to stare down at the motionless man. If we sheltered a white man in our house, we should be arrested, and if we turn him over as a prisoner, he would certainly die, Sado said. The kindest thing would be to put him back into the sea, Hana said, but neither of them moved. They were staring with a curious repulsion upon the inert figure, inert, motionless. What is he? Now, let me make a point here before I proceed. You see, both of them agreed that the best thing would be to put him back into the sea, because if they save him, then they would be arrested on charge of um, you know harboring an enemy. But at the same time, if they give him to the authorities, then he would certainly be killed. So as a human being, there was one chance to save his life, and that was to put him back into the sea. So by chance, there was a possibility that somehow his life would be saved. Both of them agreed, but none of them moved. It is interesting. And they kept staring at the inert figure. Now, what is he? Hana whispered. There is something about him that looks American, Sado said. He took up the battered cap. Yes, there almost gone was the faint lettering. A sailor, he said, from an American warship. He spelled it out. U.S. Navy. The man was a prisoner of war. Now there was no doubt he was a soldier, and you see, he was a prisoner of war, and so it was clear that he was fighting against the Japanese troops. So then, what he deserved? Obviously, he was an enemy, so he should have been killed. But then, you know, there are, as I told you in the beginning, there are humanitarian instincts also. They continue talking. He has escaped, Hana cried softly, and that is why he is wounded. In the back, Sado agreed. They hesitated, looking at each other. Then Hana said with resolution, "Come, are we able to put him back into the sea?" "If I am able, are you?" Sado asked. That is, both of them. "No," Hana said, "but if you can do it alone," that means none of them could gather courage enough to put it back into the sea. Sado hesitated again. "The strange thing is," he said, "that if the man were whole, I could turn him over to the police without difficulty. I care nothing for him. He is my enemy. Look at this. If the man were healthy, then Sado would have easily turned him over to the police, you know. Um, and he says that the man was his enemy. All Americans are my enemy. This kind of hatred prevails during the time of war, and he is only a common fellow. You see how foolish his face is? But since he is wounded, you also cannot throw him back to the sea," Hana said. So you see, it's clear now that Sado didn't want to, throw him back into the sea because he could not leave an injured person like that. As a doctor, he had to treat him. So they could neither throw him back to the sea nor hand him over to the police because, as a wounded person, the immediate thing that he needed was treatment, and Sado could do it. So that is why he was forced. So they now said, then there is only one thing to do. Uh, we must carry him into the house. But the servants, Sado inquired, we must simply tell them that we intend to give him to the police, as indeed we must. As indeed we must, Sado. We must think of children and of your position. It would be, um, it would endanger all of us if we did not give this man over as a prisoner of war. Certainly, Sado agreed. I would not think of doing anything else. So even Sado agreed that once he recovers, he would hand him over to the police. Thus agreed, thus agreed. Together, they lifted the man. He was very light, like a fowl that had been half starved for a long time until it is only feathers and skeleton. So his arms hanging, they carried him up the steps and into the side door of the house. This door opened into a passage, and down the passage they carried the man towards an empty room. It had been the bedroom of Sado's father, and since his death, it had not been used. They laid the man on the deeply matted floor. Everything here had been Japanese to please the old man, who would never in his own home sit on a chair or sleep in a foreign bed. Hana went to the wall cupboards and slid back a door and took out a soft quilt. She hesitated. The quilt was covered with flowered silk, and the lining was pure white silk. "He is so dirty," she murmured, um, in distress. "Yes, he had better be washed." Sado agreed. "If you fetch hot water, I will wash him." Okay, at this juncture, we would close this video, and I'll meet you in the next video and continue the story. Okay, so thank you very much.
Stop button.